This is Athens Speakout, and Lois and I are going to be discussing a very controversial book called Divided We Stand, written by Marjorie J. Sproul. And we're only going to be looking at the 4 days that changed the world in the first chapter. And the first item says, for myself, Houston and all of the events surrounding it have become a personal landmark in the history, the sort of events that one measures all dates in the life of being before and after. It raised the hopes of a new openness and inclusiveness in the national political events to come.
All right. Let me explain a little bit more about that, Bob.
Go ahead.
She talks about Houston and 4 days that changed the world for women, according to Gloria Steinem, the famous Ohio-born feminist author. The 4 days she's referring to in Houston have to do with events 40 years ago in 1977, when there were national meetings in every state and territory, 56 meetings about women in 1977. And I was very involved with the one in Ohio because I helped with the planning of it. Now, what they did at those 56 meetings, in addition to discussing women's issues in general, was to elect delegates to go to Houston, Texas, to a national meeting that was held about Thanksgiving time in 1977. So, and that was a 4-day event. So that is what Gloria Steinem is referring to.
All right. I would like to say that I had heard of Gloria Steinem. I saw her on television, and she wrote this in 1978 because the conference went from 77 to 78. It went over a longer period of time. And my mind was on Jimmy Carter, who was running in the Democratic Party.
He was president by then, yes.
Jimmy Carter was
in 1977.
Against. Now, let's go back to the recognition of Israel. In 1948, Thomas E. Dewey, who thought he was certainly going to beat
elected president, huh?
Elected president from Harry Truman, lost when Harry Truman recognized Israel as an independent state before Thomas E. Dewey, and he won a surprising victory by putting his religious values ahead of politics, in a sense. So Jimmy Carter, because he was raised in Plains, Georgia, was going to continue his campaign to reconcile the Palestinians and Jews, and the Jewish were they were all in favor of Jimmy Carter, because Jimmy Carter, not Jimmy Carter, they were all in favor of Truman because he beat Thomas E. Dewey.
Right,
But
yes.
by 1976, Jimmy Carter was then trying to reconcile the Palestinians and the Jews, and went on to campaign in that year, and he ran an unsuccessful one term.
Yes,
in 1976 to 1980, when he was defeated by Ronald Reagan.
That's right.
Okay,
yes.
And because of that, the Jews were very critical of Carter's naive view that he could bring the Palestinians and the Israelis together.
Mm-hmm.
And looking at the votes used to be 90%, the Jewish vote was 90% for Roosevelt, 80% for Hubert Humphrey, and they still voted for Carter, but only at the 60% level, and that was one of the reasons why Jimmy Carter had a great ideal from his point of view, but it didn't play politically. And my mind was on Jimmy Carter and not on women in that year.
Okay,
Now,
and I've already mentioned why it was such an important year as far as women were concerned. Inasmuch as, you see, Bob, in 1975, the United Nations declared a decade for women.
Fine.
And they had a year for women
Great.
at that time. And they had the first international conference for women,
Okay.
sponsored by the United Nations, which was held in 1975 in Mexico City.
Right.
And then the idea was that every country should look at its women and how things were going for women around the world.
Fine.
And so in 1976, they set up a time to have these statewide meetings,
Fine.
which were held in 1977, 40 years ago, and then finally they had the Houston meeting in late 77. But it's very much the case that women are divided, shall we say, politically, in the ways they look at things. So I think that it would be important for you to read the next
Item.
which...
Item number 2. Okay.
That's by Phyllis Schlafly.
That's right. The weekend of November 18th to 21st, 1977, in Houston, there was a decisive turning point in the war between women's liberation and those who are pro-family, and Houston was the midway battle that determined which way the winning side. Now, I saw Phyllis Schlafly on television, and I regarded her as a reactionary, old-time Catholic who put the old-time second-class citizen woman in second place. And she was divided against the more progressive liberal women, okay?
Yeah, that was something that she actually wrote in 1977 itself about just, like a week or so after the Houston meeting was held.
All right.
So
now you can start reading there. Anything you want to say there, summarize that. You're going to go to the next.
Well, I've given enough
Yeah,
of a
okay,
background,
fine.
I think, about the fact
All right.
that they held this.
All right. Well, you read as much as that as you want.
Right. Well,
And I will interrupt here with those little marks in which I disagree, see?
Okay.
All right. All right.
Well, let's see. It says in the early 1970s, both Republicans and Democrats supported the modern women's movement. But by 1980, the GOP, that's the Republicans, of course,
Right.
had sided with the other women's movement, the one that positioned family values in opposition to women's rights.
Okay. Can I say something about family values?
Sure.
The Progressive Liberal Democratic Party was kind of sneering at family values because of the Equal Rights Amendment, okay? And I was thinking of Jimmy Carter, and Jimmy Carter was running as a minority in a sense because Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill. Ronald Reagan won the election big in 1980.
Yeah,
And-
that's after
and
defeated,
Tip,
Carter.
Oh, so Carter was a failed president from the point of view of the Democratic Party, and Tip O'Neill, who was in the House of Representatives, was the only Democrat who held the line against an overwhelming Republican victory by Ronald Reagan in 1980. And the Democrats looked back upon Jimmy Carter as a failed president, okay?
Because he didn't get a second
Right.
term. Right.
Now, this thing, family values, opened up the question of equal rights, and they also opened up the question of the role of homosexuality, which is a big issue to this day.
Yes, that's true.
Okay.
And as far as that's concerned, the whole point of Marjorie Sproul's book really is to say how important the conservative women were and the reaction that they made, how important that was. I wanted to point out, too, with reference to these women's meetings that were held in 1977, that the big opponent, which was a big surprise to me, was our own congressman, Clarence Miller of Lancaster, who was our congressman from 1966 until 1992. He had a very long time in Congress representing what was at that time the 10th district, and today we, of course, in Athens are part of the 15th district.
Because
I
they
believe it
keep
is.
Ohio keeps losing congressmen.
Yes, because relatively speaking,
Population, every 10 years it's redistricted.
Right,
Okay.
and more people are living in Texas and California and Florida, and so Ohio relatively loses out population-wise. But that was Clarence Miller's big stand, which was surprising to me. In fact, I got a phone call from the American Association of University Women saying, "Did you realize that your congressman is leading the battle against having any federal money for the National Women's Meeting and the National Final Meeting in Houston?" And I said,
Okay.
"Wow, I was surprised."
Okay, well then.
You know Clarence Miller well, don't you, Bob?
Okay, well,
Why?
all right, that's the past. We'll
That's the past.
Right now, we're talking about Jimmy Carter. Okay, now.
Who's in the past?
All right, now, there were many reporters who reported this meeting.
Uh-huh.
People well known, like George Will, James K. Kilpatrick, which I knew, but he's been out of television a long time. Ellen Goodman is still around.
Yes, she was on the other side, on the liberal side.
In any case, they were reporting that David Broder of the Washington Post, he's retiring about now. So the Today Show and Good Morning America, Face the Nation were all sent reporters there to report the pros and cons of what the women were talking about.
Well, and you know, the interesting thing is that Phyllis Schlafly organized a sort of a counter meeting across the city of Houston.
Right.
And had all these conservative women come to present their points of view, because the delegation was, the delegates, number of delegates who were voted to go to Houston were overwhelmingly liberal eventually. Although in Ohio, we elected a conservative delegation that went. And I think that I just lost my
Phone?
phone here, my
TV?
microphone.
TV, okay.
But I'm going to get it back on.
Good.
Right there.
You're very
Okay.
alert.
Yeah.
I'm getting senile faster than you are.
Well, you're older than I am,
Okay.
so that makes a
Very
difference. Well, I was going to point out that I brought at an earlier session that I had the report from the Ohio Women's Meeting, and I think that Matt has a picture of that book. That's the report that was made in 1977 in July, right after we held our meeting in mid-June about what happened in Ohio. And what happened was we had 56 total delegates, which was one of the largest delegations in the U.S. But of the 56, 45 were elected from the followers of Phyllis Schlafly, and I should say Ohio Right to Life, because those were the two groups, Phyllis Schlafly's Eagle Forum and the Right to Life by the Ohio organization, especially in Cincinnati, sent so many people to vote for the delegates to go to Houston, that they won 45 out of the total.
Now, one of the women that were at this meeting was one woman that I knew way back when I first became a historian at the BA level,
Oh, really?
and that was Margaret Mead.
Oh, yes.
And all of the students were talking about Margaret Mead because she was a very radical who went to the South Seas and talked about how sex was very open there and so forth and so on.
She was an anthropologist.
Anthropologist, right?
Famous anthropologist. I read some of her works
Yeah.
when I was in college because she was big in the 1940s.
Right. But I still thought of, as a historian who put Christianity and Judaism, Catholicism and Protestantism as the three big religions in the United States when I grew up.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Now, do you want to
Well,
keep on talking here?
we're certainly going to keep on talking, but Bob, I think we need to be a little more careful.
All
here.
right, okay.
The opening chapter does give us an idea of what happened first in 77 and then in the 40 years since then in terms of divided we stand as women, as a group of women. You just can't say all women do this, all women believe that, because it's just not the case. It's the same, as you point out, with men. But this business about family values and women's rights, that's an interesting contrast. I think that most women who believe in women's rights also believe in family values, but they don't necessarily, in fact, they don't at all probably, believe that the patriarchy, that the husband, the father, should always rule the roost in the home. So there's where a difference comes.
Okay, well, one of the things that were cited, one of the people who were reporting there was the League of Women Voters. Now, I knew about the League of Women Voters when I first met you in
Ann Arbor.
Ann Arbor, because the League of Women Voters was one of the first organizations that you joined, and you have joined many, many other women's organizations. And I was kind of in favor of the League of Women Voters because they began in the 1920s when the women got the vote.
That's right. They've transferred from being backers of the 19th Amendment to being primarily, I think they're thought of as people, women mostly, but today we have many men members as well. That's a change.
And the
over
purpose
the years.
of the League was to educate housewives, their new rights as voters.
Right, and the League does this to this day. They have forums. We have a very active League of Women Voters here in Athens, and they usually have voters' forums before elections so that the candidates can speak and present their points of view and help to educate the voters, and also so voters can listen to them and decide which person they would prefer to vote for. So that's the point of having those voters' forums.
And one of the other big controversial votes, including many Catholics, mostly Catholics, opposed abortion.
Yes.
Do you want to say anything about the rights of abortion?
Well, I think that we should point out that there are very strong feelings on both sides of that.
Yes, that's right.
Feelings on both sides.
And now the Baptists, the Southern Baptists, are more right-wing and reactionary than the Roman Catholics.
Well, that may be. Certainly the Pope has spoken out.
They're beginning to soften a little bit.
Yes, the Catholics on the right of the unborn,
Yes.
as opposed to the right of the pregnant woman.
Right.
Because there are cases when women are definitely not prepared or ready to bear a child, especially if there's been domestic violence or rape or some sort of thing that has brought about a pregnancy that is not wanted. Whereas the very strict right-to-lifers believe that all unborns should be able to come to term and be born. Whereas the people who say there should be a difference, who look at the Roe versus Wade decision in 1973, which permitted looking at 3 parts to pregnancy. They called them trimesters because usually it's 9 months from conception to the birth of a baby. That in the first trimester there should be no forbidding by the state of abortion.
Now,
in the second trimester,
right.
they should consider at least somewhat the rights of the possible new person who is developing in the woman's body. And definitely in the third trimester, states can strictly regulate the possibility of these late-term abortions. But
Now,
this has been a continuing...
can I say something about the Equal Rights Amendment?
Oh, sure.
And one of the problems with the Equal Rights Amendment is that the women didn't spell out Equal Rights Amendment and kept using ERA. And that's one of my criticisms of the mass media. Too much jargon, and if the women had talked a little more about Equal Rights Amendment, they might have made a little more progress. But why is it that they usually have 7 years for ratifying a constitutional amendment, and why after 7 years they ran it again and they had another? Why was it defeated by the various states?
Well, it was defeated
the states
very much on the basis of this divided we stand sort of thing.
But constitutionally, you have to have 2/3 of the Congress,
right,
and 3/4 of the state to make a constitutional amendment.
Right, and the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA, was adopted by 35 states.
And what was
37 were needed.
Yeah, and what was the last holdout, and why?
Well, most of the southern states were holdouts. Then there were states that were very highly organized, like Illinois, which
Illinois was key.
Phyllis Schlafly is a
Yeah.
member,
And
lived in
Illinois
Illinois.
had a peculiar ratification.
Is that right?
They had more than 3/4 votes. So they were able to block it.
Well, they were able to,
Their state constitution said
oh,
you have to
okay.
have more than 3/4.
Oh,
And
that's
then,
interesting.
Then they began to boycott it.
Uh-huh.
When I was at the American Historical Association,
Yeah.
the American Historical Association says, well, we're not going to meet in Illinois because they were decisive in blocking that. And that's why it went another 7 years and it was put in there a second time.
Well, Bob, let me give you a little bit of history on that.
Yeah.
And, the Equal Rights Amendment was first passed in 1973.
Good.
And it was supposed to expire.
Right.
It's supposed to expire after 5 years.
7 years, I think.
Well, whatever it was, they had reached 34
Right.
that had ratified, but there were still 16 that hadn't.
Mostly southern states.
Mostly southern
and
states,
Illinois.
but
northern
including
state.
Illinois and Nevada, and
Right.
there were, a number of.
So then they gave it another 7 years.
No, they extended it for 3 years.
3 years.
From 1978 to, well, I guess it was 1979, because I definitely remember that the extension
Right.
extension expired in 1982.
When Ronald Reagan was elected.
Well, after Ronald Reagan
Okay,
was
after,
elected.
right.
Yeah. It was extended for 3 years, but in 1982, by then, they didn't have the 37 votes that they needed. They never got beyond the 35 votes. So that's part of this divided we stand.
Now, both Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter were endorsing this amendment for votes in 1976, 77, when Jimmy Carter was going to had to run against Jerry Ford. Okay,
Yeah.
this was a Republican comeback, but Jerry Ford, although he was very conservative, was at least willing to support the Equal Rights Amendment in order to get votes.
Mm-hmm.
So that's somewhat interesting.
Whoops.
What happened?
I'm having problems with my mic again.
Okay.
All right. Well, was there another point you wanted to make on the,
Well, I think I have made most of my criticisms and what I knew about women and why my mind was on Jimmy Carter and didn't pay too much attention to what women were thinking. Now, we can go on to a 7th chapter, if you wish.
yes. Mm-hmm. I think probably we should.
We have
Isn't
more
that
material.
about the
Well, let's flip over there.
it's about the different states.
Yeah, yeah.
And what happened at the state-wide meetings, as I mentioned earlier, there were
Okay.
56 meetings held in every state and territory in the United States.
All right, let me flip here.
That was a total of 56,
Chapter 7, 140.
140. But it tells about what happened at the different state levels.
All right.
However,
Now, let me read the title of that.
okay,
George Orwell. I thought of George Orwell when I read that title. Armageddon, state by state.
well, that's a biblical,
Right,
Armageddon is in the Bible,
right.
in the final book.
Okay. Now, Orwell is a better journalist, in my opinion, than American journalists. Because Orwell says, let's call things by their right word. Now, Armageddon is the last book in the Bible, Revelation.
It's in Revelation, yes.
Right. And many historians of the Bible think that that book is the most controversial book that should never have been included in the Bible.
Oh, really? Mm-hmm.
Because most of the Bible, both Jewish and Christian, speak about love, forgiveness, mercy. But Armageddon is a very bitter book which talks about the end of the world.
Revelation, yeah.
In other words,
Armageddon is the final battle.
Yeah, yeah. And this is purely apocryphal. This is literature. This should not be part of the historical Bible by people who take the Bible seriously as a moral document and also a religious document. So Revelation or Armageddon, it was written by John Patmos back about 100 A.D. And this begins, he was the one who invented the Antichrist.
Oh,
And this is the beginning of anti-Christianity, anti-Jewish, anti-Semite. The antis, I try to avoid this ideological thing. It's very easy in war to be anti. And during World War II, Roosevelt was anti-fascist, he was anti-Japanese, and he was
Soviet.
Soviet. No, he was not anti-Soviet. Roosevelt had to ally with Churchill and the Soviet Union in order to beat fascism and Nazism and the Japanese Empire.
Right, and so the Soviets were our allies during World War II.
Right. So I, as a historian, think that Christianity and Judaism are moral philosophies for peace. And I always put peace first because my father was a veteran of World War I. And he then was an isolationist because that was a step toward peace in his mind. Because he didn't know what a Quaker was, except that there was a Quaker oak spark. He didn't study the Quaker religion. So the Quaker religion and the Unitarian religion are now, and the Episcopalians, are one of the more liberal religious groups in talking about, and are very critical of the antis and any idea. So I try to avoid anti-communism and say, well, the American, see, this is how Ronald Reagan was elected. He was a devout anti-communist. And from the point of view of the balance of power, that drives Beijing and Moscow together. And it was Henry Kissinger who understood the balance of power and said, well, the United States should be in the center of the scale and put Beijing and Moscow on the two ends of the thing, of the scale.
Right.
Now, as long as
balance.
Yeah, as long as you stay in Vietnam, you're pushing them together because the Soviets and the Chinese are going to support Vietnam.
The communists in
Communists,
Vietnam.
that's right. So communism, anti-communism, was a bad ideology, and you should talk about the balance of power, and that's what Kissinger did. Let's talk about Chinese as a nation state. China wants this, and the Soviet Union wants that, and put the United States in the center of the balance, okay? And the Vietnam War was driving the two communist powers together rather than dividing him. So Kissinger said to Ronald Reagan, I can get you elected president in 1974, but you are not going to win the Vietnam War.
72.
72.
That was when, well,
Yeah, he was
Let's-
he was impeached in 74. He was resigned in 74.
That's right.
Right, but 72.
We're talking about Nixon.
Nixon.
Yeah.
Okay. So people have called Nixon and Reagan the odd couple, and that came from a famous movie.
Yeah.
They were an odd couple in which Kissinger got Reagan to disarm.
Eventually, yeah.
Yes,
They signed a treaty.
And that was the end of the so-called Cold War and the end of the atomic arms race.
Yes, there was
Okay.
Reagan signed sort of a peace treaty.
All right.
Not an official peace treaty, but a
So
sort of
I
a
only
peace
got
treaty.
to the title of that book, and there's more to say from the women's point of view.
Oh, yes, definitely.
let's look at that.
We've gotten a little bit off that
I
topic.
got off the title. The very title bothered me.
Yes,
I explained-
Armageddon.
Yeah.
Well, but what it's about, Bob.
Yes,
that's-
let's continue. Let's
yeah,
get the-
what
let's
it's
get the-
about is,
Let's get the page number there, and you can rattle on. Okay.
well, I am rattling on
All right,
to
let's-
point out that
all right.
that chapter is about the different states and what happened in the
All
different
right.
states.
So you
But
start
one-
commenting anything you want.
Right. Well, did you lose your? No, you're okay.
All right. Okay.
Your microphone is still
All right.
on.
So I'll hold the thing open and have the glass here.
All right, but the point that I want to make is
ahead.
that this so-called Armageddon is the final battle in the Book of Revelation, and state by
But
state
it's a
there were
fictional
battles.
battle. Yeah. Oh, state by state. Okay.
State by state, the women's meetings turned into battles.
Right.
And I've already mentioned that
But
in
that's
the
an
state
exaggerated
in the
metaphor.
state of Ohio,
Right.
in the state of
Yeah,
Ohio,
but there's no real Armageddon in Ohio.
well,
It's not the end of the world.
okay.
That's what I'm trying to say.
But if you notice, she puts, believe she puts.
No,
oh
she-
no, she just uses that as a
provocative title.
provocative title. There was a big, in many states, there was a big battle about who was going to go to Houston.
Right.
But as I have pointed out, Ohio was one of the few states, I think there were about 7 or 8, that sent a predominantly conservative group of 45 women compared to 11 women who were liberals, sent 45 conservatives to Houston. So Ohio was one of the prime battles where there was, quote,
Okay.
Armageddon.
So you can read anything there you want, and
Well, I just want to point out that I have read this, of
All right.
course. I've read this.
explain it to the audience.
Well, I want to explain to the audience that they have very little on Ohio. She has about 1 paragraph on Ohio. Now, I know a lot more about what happened in Ohio because I was
Well,
here.
I thought you already covered that with Clarence Miller.
Well, but what I said was that having been on the state committee that planned the women's meeting for mid-June 1977, I saw Ohio up close.
Good.
Marjorie Sproul doesn't know much about Ohio. I don't
Very
think
good.
she ever looked at
Probably not.
Of
course not.
at the report that I.
You put the port on there.
Yeah, I had the
Okay, fine.
report.
Okay.
Earlier, Matt showed
All right.
the cover of the report that came out of Ohio. I don't think she ever read the Ohio
right.
report. Now, I must admit, I haven't read any of the other reports from other states, but she is much more, she goes into much more detail about other states than she does
All right.
about
So
Ohio.
you can keep reading there and make any comments you want.
Well, that was my primary
All right, well,
comment.
let's go
Now,
through the whole
and-
chapter.
And let me say this, Bob.
Go ahead.
Our meeting in Ohio was one of the earliest of the meetings. It was held in June of '77. And actually, there were, I think, something like 12 meetings held that same weekend because they were doing 56 total,
56 what?
state meetings.
Oh, okay, fine.
State and territorial meetings, 50 states and 6 territories.
All right.
And so 12 of them were held on June 11th and 12th, 1977, one of which was Ohio. But we were among the earliest. There had been a few a little bit earlier on, but not that many. That was the first big weekend of statewide meetings in the United States in 1977 of the women's meetings. So after what happened at our meeting, I remember getting on the phone real fast and calling people in the nearby states, you know, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Indiana, West Virginia, Kentucky, and telling them about what had happened in Ohio and how so many people came in, women, but not just women, because of course actually it was a meeting that was open to anyone over age 18 who was an American citizen and had $1 to present as you know, the registration.
Okay, now.
So there were some men there.
Fine, okay. Now, looking at this booklet, the title of the booklet is called Sexual Preference, Why It Is, what does that word say?
Why is lesbianism
a woman's issue?
A women's issue.
That
Okay.
was the title of the document.
That was the title of a
Very
particular,
controversial.
very particular.
And they go through
pamphlet.
there, and there's a footnote there. But this is all kind of like ideological and propaganda. And I have down here the comment of statistics.
Statistics.
Yeah, do you have any statistics?
Well, I certainly can't cite statistics
Well, they are in the footnote.
offhand, but
They
what
are.
I can tell you, Bob, is
Yeah.
that the two issues that were the most controversial
Yeah.
in the women's meetings were abortion
Right.
and lesbianism, lesbian rights.
Well, I would like to see statistics, how many were opposed on the abortion question and how many were opposed on the lesbian question, and how big a factor was that?
Well,
And I think if-
I can tell you about Ohio. First of all, the lesbian issue did not come up in Ohio.
Good,
Now,
from my point of view.
all right, it did not come up. It was not one of the things that people voted on. However, abortion was
Right.
one of the issues that came up. There were something like 14 different issues.
Right.
And I think that the top issue in terms of support was equal credit ratings. You know, back in the day, back in the 70s, in the early 70s anyway, married women had to get their husbands' signatures and so on if they had supposedly their own checking account and so on, okay? So that was probably the issue that most women thought was a bad idea, was this credit thing that was opposed to women's rights.
Okay.
Now, the two most controversial issues that did come before the Ohio meeting were the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment and choice on abortion. Those were the two most controversial issues. Now, the interesting thing is that I found in the report that those two, which were the bottom two issues, 904 people voted for abortion rights, and 704 people voted for the Equal Rights Amendment.
Okay.
But I think that was a mistake. I think it was a typographical error. I think that they read 9 as 7. I bet that both of those were 904, because those were very similar. And I'm sure that the Equal
Well, you'll
Rights
have to write a
Amendment.
special footnote to somebody.
Yes, yes, I would.
Okay.
But that was published 40 years ago.
Okay.
And so It's still, I think, in all the Ohio libraries. At least we sent out a copy of that report to every library in Ohio. But maybe by now they've figured, hey, that happened 40 years ago, who cares? And they've gotten rid
Well,
of their copies.
getting back to my Orwellian philosophy,
Yeah,
I see there's another cliche here.
yeah.
The discussion has been downgraded ever since. And here is this slogan, hot button issues.
Hot button issues,
Yeah.
yeah. Those were the hot button issues.
That's a metaphor.
Yeah. Well, it's...
Why are there more hot button issues now than there were before these meetings?
I don't know that there are more now than there were before. Are
Well,
there? You
TV
tell
talks
me
about a
what-
hot button, the wedge issues, hot button issues.
All right.
And right now we have the big hot button issue is this Hollywood expose of
Harvey Weinstein.
yeah, and that's leading to the Fox Channel, and the women
Oh,
are coming
yes,
out. And
right.
So
Yeah,
there's been a
that's true.
recovery.
It's
of-
definitely a hot button issue
and,
now.
and now the old rape
Mm-hmm.
was downplayed for many years,
Well, women.
but now it's becoming
women
in the forefront. And
Women
that's
were
gonna
so
play-
ashamed
Yeah.
of something that most of them had definitely not done anything to
Yeah.
incite. I mean, they just couldn't,
That's right. Now,
avoid being sexually
you know-
molested.
I had an aunt, very old, who
Yeah.
was raped in Long Island,
Yeah.
and she had to go to New Jersey
She had to move out of state, in other
to
words.
get a quick divorce.
I don't think she was married at the time, was she?
She was
Bob?
not married.
But the man
No,
involved
she
perhaps
was adopted by her great aunt.
Mm-hmm.
And after she was raped, the rapist ran away to California and was never heard of again.
Uh-huh.
So this was a lawsuit in New Jersey for abandonment. So Aunt Georgie then, her Aunt Georgie,
Uh-huh.
my great aunt,
Uh-huh.
became the godmother, you might say, of this.
Woman who'd been molested, your aunt.
Yeah.
Yes.
But I only found out about that in 1970s when I took her on a long-distance trip.
And she finally told you this story of what had happened
She had
to her.
married an alcoholic. And I said, why did you marry this alcoholic anyway? And my mother and father always used to criticize my aunt for having a new boyfriend, because this alcoholic died in 1939, and my aunt lived up into the 70s and 80s, right?
Right. I remember she was.
Right.
She was a lively gal.
So I said to her, why did you ever marry Uncle Dave in the first place? Well, she said, nobody else would have me.
Oh yes.
That's
and that was part of the horror. That's part of the horror of rape, is that women feel shamed and they are treated
and
shamefully
and
after rape,
Yeah.
which is usually not their fault.
well, it's now coming back to haunt them. The men, they're now
The women are
harassment.
speaking out
Yeah,
about sexual harassment
And Donald Tr-
especially rape, of
yeah.
course.
And Donald Trump is so vulgar that he's brought all of the pornographers and vulgar people together and thinks that he's going to save America. Well, that remains to be seen.
Yes. Well, he's working at it, but I don't know that we're not particularly partisans of Mr. Trump
Absolutely
for
not.
whatever reason.
Most people in Athens City are against Trump.
Probably
Athens
so.
County are still old-fashioned, die-hard Republicans.
Could be. There are many.
So that's the problem of politics and religion.
And,
And
that
women's
is
values.
that gets right back to divided we stand.
That's right. So there are two divides, men and women amongst themselves.
Yes.
And
Men-
the men have been more united in Don't ask, don't tell.
Oh, certainly. They believe in don't ask and don't tell.
And that played a big role in ever since those meetings. They kind of opened up what we'd say is a can of worms.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that Marjorie Sproul points out.
Good.
That in 1977, when the National Women's Meeting was held, these 4 days that Gloria Steinem speaks of in Houston helped open up the can of worms. But the 70s were very interesting because first they passed the Equal Rights Amendment. It was the first time it had gotten out of committee since the 1920s, 50 years. It had never gotten out of congressional committee. And when it first got out of congressional committee, it was passed. It was passed overwhelmingly, both in the House and the Senate. It was sent to the states, and boom, they didn't make it.
We only have 2 minutes.
Okay.
We're going to summarize this.
All right.
And I might raise a new issue of the question of Mary Tyler Moore and fiction. Have you ever heard of Mary Tyler?
Oh, sure. She was a well-known actress.
This is the celebrity issue.
Yeah. She was a well-known actress. And she had a TV show where she was a very positive woman. I must admit, I never really watched it particularly.
Right.
But it was quite popular in the 1970s.
Well, through celebrities, that's the way the Democratic Party raises money. And
well,
that's their
all parties are very glad to have celebrities on their side and get money from them and get endorsements from them. And I guess that's part of politics, isn't it, Bob?
Okay.
But we've been talking today about Divided We Stand by Marjorie J. Sproul. And it's called, the subtitle is The Battle Over Women's Rights and Family Values That Polarized American Politics.
And my comment is it's been more polarized since that meeting than ever before.
In other words, you agree with Marjorie Sproul because that's her thesis also.
Right.
Yes.
Okay, fine. And my very final word is men and women think differently.
Yes, well.
When we traveled, you look at X, Y, and Z, and I look at ABC. I was looking at Jimmy Carter, and you were looking at the women.
In 1977.
That's right.
Right. Well, it's always interesting to have, how do you put it?
Well, we believe in debate. Both of us believe in debate.
Right.
And you think historically, even though you have 3 MAs, you all use the historical mindedness in all of them.
Yes, I
You have
hope
one in
so.
education, one in political science, and one in history. And they all have, because you got your BA in history from a better university than I did at Stanford, and you are a better writer by far.
Well, thank you for that endorsement. Lois Whealey signing off, and Bob Whealey signing off for Speakout, right?
Right.